The three sub-races in question are referred to as the red race. The following races between the third and fourth do not have their starting point because there is a lot of mixed blood. The fourth race, although vastly different from each other, have a characteristic feature called yellow, and this color may correctly refer to the skin of the Turanian and Mongolian people, but to the relatively slightly white Semitic and Akkadian people. The Turanian sub-race or the fourth race has their regional origins on the eastern side of the continent, south of the mountainous area inhabited by the Tlavatli people. The Turanians were a race of colonizers from their early days, migrating to the land east of Atlantis. They never really became the dominant race on the mother continent, although some tribes and family races became quite strong. The large central area of the continent's western and southern regions of the mountainous district of Tlavatli is a special area despite their absence from their settlements, because they lived together on the land with the Toltec race. Regarding the original Semitic race or the fifth race of ethnologists, there is little explanation, because it is very difficult. They have to consider the very insufficient data. This sub-race has its origins in the southern mountainous part which forms more than two northeastern peninsulas which are, as we have seen, is now represented by Scotland, Ireland and some of the surrounding seas. In this case at least a few competing races from the great continent grew and developed, over the centuries maintaining independence against the aggressive attacks of the King of the South, until the time came for it in turn to spread beyond the region and colonize. Must keep in mind that by the time the Semites were advancing in strength thousands of years had passed and had been accomplished. They are a race that is always at war with their neighbors, especially with the new power that is then developing, namely the Akkadians race. The birthplace of the Akkadian sub-race or sixth race, this race is known to have existed after the great catastrophe of 800,000 years ago that its awakening took place in the land east of Atlantis, around the center of a large southeastern peninsula stretching out towards the old continent. The place may be located at latitude 42 degrees north and longitude 10 degrees east. They did not take long however, confined themselves to their homeland, but overran the now diminished continent of Atlantis. They fought with the Semites in many battles on both land and sea, and very large fleets were used on both sides. Finally about 100,000 years ago they were completely defeated by the Semites, and since then an Akkadian dynasty was established in the old Semitic capital, and ruled the country wisely for several hundred years. They were colonies by doing great trade, crossing the sea and colonizing people, and they established many communication centers with distant lands. The Mongolian sub-race or race 7 appears to be the only one completely unrelated to the mother continent. Originating in the Tartar Plain at about latitude 63 degrees north and longitude 140 degrees east, it was directly developed from the descendants of the Turanian race, which was gradually replaced over much of Asia. This sub-race has multiplied very much, and even today the majority is the population of the Earth. Sub-race 1. The Armoahals were unable to develop an enduring power, nor did they progress even as high as the civilization point in the 6 and 7 Lemurian races. The Atlantean race is divided into two major rival races, and what began in the Armoahal era is heavily emphasized in the Toltec era. Battles are devastation at every age in world history. There was no longer any wise rule of initiating the emperor, whose followers of black magic rose in revolt and established a rival to the emperor, who after many struggles and battles overthrew the white emperor from its capital, city of Gold Gates, and established itself on the throne. The white emperor driven north again established himself in a city originally founded by Tlavatli on the southern edge of the mountainous district, but who now ruled from one of the Toltec kings of the river area. He happily welcomed the white emperor and placed the city in exile. A few more of the river kings also remained loyal to him, but most of their allegiance to the new emperor ruled in the old capital. These, however, did not remain loyal for long. Permanent pronouncements of independence were made by the kings of the river, and the constant battles that were fought in various parts of the empire, a practice of magic which was largely compelled to undertake, to complement the destructive power of their armies. This event occurred some 50,000 years before the first big catastrophe. Since then things have gone from bad to worse. Sorcerers used their powers more and more recklessly, and a greater and greater number of people sacrificed and practiced this terrible, black magic. Then came an even more terrible thing when millions of people died. The current Golden City Gate was made perfect by evil. The waves swept over and destroyed the population, the emperor and his dynasty fell and never rose again, the northern emperors and priests started across the continent had long realized the crimes of that day, and then many of the chief priests emigrated before the disaster occurred, and they later lived and settled. The remaining population has also received dire warnings that we will eventually find a Semitic dynasty of sorcerers reigning in the city of Gold Gates, but none of the Toltecs' power rose to high during the second period. There was still quite a Toltec population at that time, but few of the purebreds remained on the continent. On the island of Ruta, however, in the third period, the Toltec dynasty rose to power again and ruled through kings around the river and most of the island. This dynasty is understood to be more general during all four periods, until the occurrence of disaster is inevitable. Akkadians in the third period, about 100,000 years ago, that the Akkadians finally overthrew Semitic rule. These 6 sub-races are far more law-abiding people than their predecessors. Traders and seafarers, they lived in settled communities, and naturally produced an oligarchic form of government. Sparta is the only modern example of a dual system of 2 kings ruling over one city. As a result, perhaps their ocean-going taste, the study of stars became a characteristic pursuit, and this race made great advances in both astronomy and astrology. The Mongolians from their direct Turanian ancestors were brutal. Born as they were in the vast grasslands of eastern Siberia, they never had contact with the mother continent, and because, no doubt, with their environment, they became a nomadic people. More psychic and more religious than the Turanians. The Turanian race, as we have seen, is imbued with a spirit of colonialism, which was practiced for a long time. Semites and Akkadians have also to some extent experienced racial colonization. For this reason, when Atlantis reached its peak in the Toltec era, the proportion of the population with square miles on the continent of Atlantis probably contained this race, as in England and Belgium. The invading Tlavatli race seemed to have spread to every point of the continent. In the second period, their descendants settled on the west coast of the American continent and then developed California, and on the south coast, Rio de Janeiro. They were also found occupying the east coast of the island of Scandinavia, while they sailed across the sea, until the coast of Africa even reached India. There, mixing with the customs of the Lemurian people, they formed the Dravidian race. In later days, this in turn received the crossbreeding of Aryan or blood of the fifth race, which resulted in the complexity of the types found in India today. In fact, we have examples of evidence, incarnated among Brahmins, in the fourth among the lower castes, and some among the hill tribes. In the fourth period, we find the Tlavatli people occupying the southern part of South America, from which it can be concluded that the isolated inhabitants were of Tlavatli descent. Remnants of this competition, as a race of Armoahals, have been found in the Quaternary strata of Central Europe, and the Dolichocephalus called Cro-Magnon can be taken as a specimen found. The only person who can take as a specimen is considered pure blood. To date are some of the brown tribes of South American Indians. Burmese and Siamese have Tlavatli blood in their veins, but in their case it is mixed with or is dominated by the Aryan sub-race. We now come to the Toltec race. To the west, that they tended to emigrate from the American continent, were in the second period inhabited by the pure Toltec race. On the continents of North and South America that this race spread abroad and developed, and which thousands of years later founded the kingdoms of Mexico and Peru, with such evidence provided by the magnificent architectural remains. The Golden Age of Toltec occurred about 400,000 years ago as a very long period that occurred in the past. The first great catastrophe destroyed this civilization. The moral degradation of people with the practice of black magic is widespread. When the time came, a cult lodge founded an empire of Egypt's first divine dynasty, and started teaching the people. Thus it is that the first greatness occurred in the colonists of Atlantis, and sometime during the 10,000 years that occurred to the second disaster, 2 great pyramids of Giza were built, partly to provide the permanent halls of initiation, but also to act as treasure houses and temples for some. Adoration of great power. Bull and cow horns with religious ideas, as revealed in the oldest hymn of the Aryans and the cow-headed idol of Troy. After the head of their great god Baal they put a bull horn. And this has come down in the popular imagination of the civilization of Atlantis. Charles Walcott Brooks, California Academy of Sciences, said, according to Chinese history, Tycho Foki, a great foreign king, ruled Kingdom of China. In the picture he is represented with 2 small horns, as associated with the representation of Moses. He and his successor are said to have introduced to China drawing writing, as it was used in Central America at the time of the Spanish conquest. He taught the movement of celestial bodies, and divided time into years and months. Will also introduce many other useful arts and sciences. Now, there have been found in Copan, in Central America, a striking figure like the Chinese symbol Foki, with two horns, and, in a way there is a close resemblance between Central America. Chinese records say that the ancestors of the Chinese race came from across the ocean. The two little horns of Tycho Foki and Musa are probably mementos of Baal. We find Baal horns represented in remnants of the European Bronze Age. The bell sometimes wore a tiara with its bull horns. The tiara was a crown later worn by kings. King of Persia, and it became, in time, a symbol of papal authority. It turns out that the continent of Atlantis is Indonesia. Atlantis, the lost continent's finally found. Where was it found? Question mark. He explicitly stated that the location of Atlantis, which was lost since approximately 11,600 years ago, was in Indonesia. The correct location is conclusively Indonesia, he said. Santos said that he had been researching the possible location of Atlantis for the past 29 years. The knowledge used by Santos in tracing the location of Atlantis is geology, astronomy, paleontology, archaeology, linguistics, ethnology, and comparative mythology. Plato told me that Atlantis was a prosperous country with gold, precious stones, and a mother of all civilization, with a continent-sized kingdom that controlled shipping, trade, mastered metallurgy, had irrigation networks, with a life of art, dance, theater, music, and sports. The citizens of Atlantis, who were respectable and wealthy, then turned ambitious. The authorities then punished them by bringing floods, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes so great that they drowned the entire continent. According to Santos, the time measure given by Plato was 11,600 years BP, before present, coinciding with the end of the Pleistocene Ice Age, which also caused devastating floods and earthquakes. This disaster caused the extinction of 70% of the species of mammals living at that time, including possibly two human species, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon. Prior to the flood disaster, the islands of Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan and Nusa Tenggara were still attached to the Malaysian peninsula and the continent. Asia. Indonesia's position lies on three tectonic plates that press against each other, which creates a series of volcanoes starting from Sumatra, Java, Nusa Tenggara, and continuing north to the Philippines, which is part of the Ring of Fire. The main mountains mentioned by Santos, which played an important role in this disaster, were Mount Krakatau and another mountain, possibly Mount Toba. Other mountains mentioned, in connection with mythological stories, are Mount Semeru, Mount Agung, and Mount Rinjani. This successive natural disaster, according to Santos, began with the powerful explosion of Mount Krakatau, which destroyed the entire mountain itself, and formed a large caldera, namely the Sunda Strait, which separated the islands of Sumatra and Java. This eruption caused a tsunami with very high sea waves, which then covered it. The lowlands between Sumatra and peninsular Malaysia, between Java and Kalimantan, and between Sumatra and Kalimantan. The ash resulting from the eruption of Mount Krakatau in the form of fly ash, rises high into the air and is blown by the wind to all parts of the world which at that time were still mostly covered by ice, Pleistocene Ice Age. This ash then descended and covered the ice sheet. As a result of the ash layer, the ice then melts as a result of the sun's heat being absorbed by the ash layer. Glacier at the North Pole and Europe then melts and flows to all lower parts of the Earth, including Indonesia. The flooding caused by the tsunami and melting ice caused seawater to rise about 130 meters above the lowlands of Indonesia. The lowlands in Indonesia are submerged below sea level, and what remains is the plateau and volcanic peaks. This large water pressure creates a strong pull and pressure on the continental plates, which in turn cause subsequent volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. The terrible Earth. The result was a dramatic end to the Pleistocene Ice Age. In his book, Plato mentions that Atlantis was a prosperous country bathed in the sun all the time. Even though the era at that time was the Ice Age, where the temperature of the Earth as a whole was approximately 15 degrees Celsius cooler than now. The only location bathed in the sun at that time was Indonesia, which was located on the equator. Plato also mentioned that the area of the lost continent of Atlantis, bigger than Libya, North Africa, and Asia Minor combined into one less than. This area is exactly the same as the area of Indonesia plus the area of the South China Sea. But the reality shows that Atlantis was under Indonesian waters and nowhere else. Even though it is told in their respective languages, it turns out that many of the terms used refer to the same thing or event. Santos concluded that the inhabitants of Atlantis consisted of several tribes. Ethnicity, where the two largest tribes are Aryan and Dravidas. In that ice age, Atlantis was a tropical paradise with beautiful fields, mountains, precious stones, metals of various kinds, perfume, rivers, lakes, irrigation canals, highly productive agriculture, golden palaces with silver walls, elephants, and various other wild animals. According to Santos, only Indonesia is this rich. When the disaster described above occurred, where the seawater rose as high as approximately 130 meters, the survivors of Atlantis were forced to leave and move to India, Southeast Asia, China, Polynesia, and America. The Aryans who migrated to India first moved and settled in the Indus Valley. Because the Himalayan glaciers also melted and flooded the Indus Valley, they migrated further to Egypt, Mesopotamia, Palestine, North Africa, and North Asia. In these new places they then tried to redevelop the culture of Atlantis, which was the root of their culture. The best records of the sinking of the continent of Atlantis were recorded in India through washing traditions in areas such as Lanka, Kumari Kandan, Tripura, and others. They are the heirs of this drowning culture. Darker-skinned Dravidas remain in India. This massive migration could explain the sudden or instantaneous emergence of advanced technologies such as agriculture, precious stone processing, metallurgy, religion, and above all languages and alphabets around the world during what is called the Neolithic Revolution, from Sanskrit and Dravidian. Hence the languages of the world are very advanced in terms of grammar and semantics. An example is the alphabet. All alphabets show the existence of a "fingerprint" from India, which at that time was an integral part of Indonesia. It was from Indonesia that the seeds of civilization were born, which later developed into the culture of the Indus Valley, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Haiti, Greece, Minoan, Crete, Rome, Incan, Maya, Aztec, and others. These cultures recognize very similar myths. The names of Atlantis in various ethnic groups are referred to as Tala, Atala, Patala, Talatala, Tuli, Talan, Aslan, Tululok, and others. The evidence that strengthens Indonesia as Atlantis, compared to other alternative locations, concluded Professor Santos in a matrix which he called the checklist. Regardless of whether this theory is true or not, or whether it can be proven or not in the future the existence of Atlantis under the sea in Indonesia, Professor Santos's theory has so far been able to attract the attention of outsiders to Indonesia. This proof that the archipelago is part of the civilization of Atlantis can be seen from the architectural characteristics of the building, namely the shape of a bull or cow horn.